Hey everybody, welcome back to another week of Striper Migration Reports with On the Water. My name is Matt Haeffner. I'm the assistant editor here at On the Water magazine. First off, I want to wish everybody a happy Memorial Day weekend. It's one of the best weekends to be out on the water, especially if you're striped bass fishing. There's a lot going on. It's also one of the busiest weekends on the water, so exercise a little extra caution out there this weekend. And without further ado, let's dive right into the striped bass fishing this week. Striped bass have finished their exit out of the Chesapeake Bay, and there's still some great fishing going on inside the bay. If you target those deeper channels, especially along the shipping channel edges, a lot of people love trolling there. Flutter spoons are a great option. You can also jig some big paddle tails like tsunami and storm swim shads. Can't go wrong with those. Another technique that I've never tried before that I think is really cool is live lining spot. They're a real popular species down in Chesapeake Bay in southern New Jersey. Not so much up here in New York, Cape Cod, New England areas, but live lining bunker is a close second. The Chesapeake Bay tribs are still fishing well for stripers. Just be careful of those regulations. Depending on where you're fishing, the regulations will change. So before you go out this weekend, especially if you plan on keeping any fish, double check the regs in your area and make sure that you're fishing in an area where you're allowed to harvest. On the Atlantic-facing beaches of Virginia and Maryland, we've got some stripers hitting from the jetties. They're hitting on topwaters and soft plastic jigs. Although now with the water having warmed up quite a bit out front, there's going to be a bycatch of everything from red drum to speckled trout to possibly even occasional black drum. For surfcasters looking to target striped bass around Virginia and Maryland, artificials are still your best bet. If you start throwing chunk baits from the beach, you risk catching some cow nose rays, black drum, some of the species that you don't necessarily want to be handling, like a lot of those dogfish sharks. And moving on up the coast a little bit to the Delaware Bay and southern New Jersey area, there's still some good striper fishing to be had in the back bays, as well as out in the surf, although a lot of those fish are going to be in the 25 to 35 inch range at the most. The fish cruising the beach will take sand fleas, otherwise known as sand crabs, and with the warm temperatures we're seeing this weekend, you can pretty much bet that there are going to be some bass cruising in the wash out front. South Jersey had a bit of a difficult week on the fishing front. It was very gusty conditions down there. So most of the striped bass fishing was reserved to the back bays, where it was even difficult to cast a fly line. Captain Brian Williams of Bad Fish Charters reported tough conditions, and he actually ended up switching from fly back to light tackle jigs and poppers for most of his charters this week. They're still finding fish. It's just, a bit more of a challenge. They're not really on the flats like they were. They're going to be in a little bit deeper water, stacking up in those deeper holes. And like always, if you're fishing at nighttime, target those bridges where the bait is pretty much just funneled through for the bass, and you can bet that they're going to be stacked up like cordwood. And northern New Jersey is still seeing some of those big bass hang around out front. They're stacked up in areas around heavy structure, and if you can find bunker schools, you can pretty much bet that there's going to be bass under them. Now, whether those bass have come from the Delaware Bay, the Chesapeake Bay, or straight up out of the Hudson, there's no real way of telling. All I know is that if you're in North Jersey this weekend, odds are you're going to have a great time out on the water. Water temperatures inside of Raritan Bay have warmed up significantly since the past couple of weeks. So if you're in Raritan Bay, your best bet's going to be jigging unless you find a surface feed, and jigging those bunker spoons, large soft plastics like No Live Bait Needed or Big Bait Fishing LLC, something with a real good thud behind the paddle tail to attract those bigger bass, are going to be the most productive lures to use this weekend. Striped bass fishing has also been excellent around New York City and Western Long Island. The south shore of Western Long Island has big schools of bunker out front, big bass sitting underneath them, some of them up to 40 plus pounds. Meanwhile, inside the back bays like Jamaica Bay, the bite's been a little bit more tough. The early morning hours are probably the best bet, and the bass are definitely on a little bit smaller bait now inside the bay. Keep an eye out for birds diving around sunrise. That's always a good indicator of some fish on top. And up in the Western Sound on the North Shore, there are also big bass underneath those bunker schools. However, there's been a lot of big bluefish mixed in with them. So if you're live lining bunker, try to use a steel leader. You might end up losing a couple of rigs otherwise. And those bluefish can be a lot of fun, but they can really be a nuisance when you're trying to dial into some trophy stripers. And just east of the Rockaways on the South Shore, out to about Great South Bay, the bass bite is still on in the back bays, although it's pretty much reserved to the deeper channels that connect different parts of the bay. In those channels, jigging with light soft plastics, spoons, and even casting walk-the-dog style topwaters along the channel edges and current seams is going to be a great way to tackle those back bay bass. Further out on the south shore of Long Island, as we push towards Montauk, the beach bite is still on out front. We've gotten good reports of bass in the slot range biting out front in the wash. They're feeding on everything from chunked bunker, clam bellies, and sand fleas, just like they do down in South and North Jersey. In a lot of cases, these bass are pressed up on the beach lips, so you don't really have to cast very far. You're just pitching your bait out and letting it soak in the wash. Meanwhile, on the north shore of Long Island, around bouldery structure, bass are feeding on everything from juvenile scup to small sea bass, and there have been a ton of spearing around. In the early morning hours, bass are pushing those schools of rain bait up onto the shoreline, and it's creating some spectacular summer-style blitzes. But as the water warms up throughout the day, those bass are going to head back to their deeper locales, and anglers can best target them by jigging or trolling the tube and worm. And with an amazing herring run this year, larger stripers are staging on the outsides of the rivers that are spilling into the Long Island Sound on Connecticut's shoreline. There are bass from 30 inches to 30 pounds, and they're being taken on everything from topwater, flutter spoons, swim shads, and minnow plugs from surf casters. Along Connecticut's shoreline, some of the prime target areas are going to be those jetties, especially because right now the eastern Long Island Sound is absolutely paved with scup on the bottom. Now, scup tend to congregate around rocky areas like those jetties, so if you're out fishing in the morning, jigging paddle tail soft plastics is almost always going to be a more productive option than throwing something like minnow plugs. But if you do tend to find bass on the surface, keep a couple topwater walk the dog style plugs, bottleneck poppers, and pencil poppers. And that trend of striped bass being in the 30-inch to 30-plus pound range will continue on up the coast through Connecticut into Rhode Island's waters this week. Now, up in Rhode Island, we've got big bass inside of Narragansett Bay, chasing out the last of those squid that have been in there for the past month or so. Boaters are having great success with jigging, while surf casters throwing minnow plugs from the rocks are doing really well for themselves. And it sounds like there's been a little bit of a recent influx in bunker inside the bay as well. Now, moving to those front-facing beaches, they're going to be stripers of the same class, feeding on a little bit of a different bait. And much like we said about Connecticut, those bass are going to be keyed in on baits like scup, juvenile sea bass, even some small tautog living around the rocks, bergal, things like that. Still, though, in the early morning hours, those bass that are typically hunkered down around the boulder fields during the day are more likely to be on the move in the early morning when the water temperatures are at their coolest. And that heightened early morning activity from big stripers in the 30 to 40 pound range will carry over to Buzzards Bay this week, where after last Friday's new moon, there were tons of bass pushing through Buzzards Bay and through the canal into Cape Cod Bay this week. And just like weeks past, there's an absolute buffet of bait out here for bass. We've got them on everything from butterfish, bunker, squid, mackerel, even some juvenile herring. The Cape Cod Canal, as a result, saw some stellar fishing throughout the course of the week, with bass up to 35 plus pounds being landed routinely, although most of the activity was reserved to the early morning hours around dawn. Especially when those breaking tides in the Cape Cod Canal line up with sunrise, it is like the perfect recipe for catching big bass on top. And for other anglers interested in catching big bass on top, the Rips and Vineyard and Nantucket Sounds have been fishing pretty well. There's a ton of squid on the south side in Vineyard and Nantucket Sounds right now. There's also a ton of scup. Unfortunately, the outer Cape beaches haven't really turned on as we'd hoped, but the fishing in Cape Cod Bay is making up for the lost action on the outer Cape beaches. Surf casters in Cape Cod Bay have been doing extremely well on minnow plugs, especially in mackerel color this week. Meanwhile, the boats are finding some fantastic feeds out in the bay, especially towards the east end of the canal, as bass blitz on mackerel and big schools of sand eels. Now, as we move up the coast along the south shore of Massachusetts towards Boston, there's a whole separate buffet of bait with a lot of the same stuff we saw in Cape Cod Canal and Buzzards Bay last week. We're seeing everything from bunker, mackerel, silver sides, and juvenile herring stacked up along the shorelines. Last week, I was fishing around the Plymouth area and couldn't help but notice when I turned my headlight on for a split second, the water in front of me completely erupted with schools of silver sides. Try to keep my headlight off, but sometimes you got to survey the bait in the area to understand what the bass are biting on. And wow, there was so much spearing as far as my eyes could see. Now, this is a great time of year, too, to live line mackerel. Bridling them and pitching them into the rocks like Captain Brian Coombs tends to do is one of the best ways to target big bass on light tackle. And if live lining is just not your thing, casting minnow plugs, like I was saying before, those SP minnows in mackerel color are a great option. But also, especially if you're fishing in the morning before the sun comes up or right around sunrise, casting walk the dog style topwaters and small poppers over those boulder fields should yield some bass in the 10 to 20 pound range. So if you're fishing the south shore of Massachusetts this week, think mackerel for bait. Otherwise, your best bet's going to be targeting those herring run areas on the ebb or incoming tides. Meanwhile, a bit further north up in Boston, bass are gorging on herring in the harbor and even up in some of the rivers nearby. They're pinning herring to the shorelines in the early morning, and it's leading to some exciting topwater fishing for surf casters in skinny water. And over the next couple weeks, as those herring continue to trickle out of the rivers into Boston Harbor, you can bet that there's going to be a great flutter spoon bite inside the harbor as well. And while herring remain the main source of forage for striped bass around the greater Boston area, a little bit further up the coast, the North Shore is abundant with squid and mackerel, particularly around Salem Sound. And with all the squid around, surf casters in the Cape Ann area that are boulder hopping are finding great action on topwaters throughout the course of the day. It's worth keeping a few different styles of topwaters in your bag. Walk the dogs, poppers, but it would also make sense to keep a couple metals and subsurface plugs like cotton cordell, redfins, and bombers. There hasn't been a ton of movement from fish this past week since the new moon tides, but anglers around Boston and the North Shore can bet that there are bigger bass on the way They're just staged up in Cape Cod Bay right now and in the Buzzards Bay area, gorging on bait before they head up with the next moon tides. And meanwhile, in southern Maine, the topwater bite continues, but medals have also become a popular lure this week with a lot of smaller bass around. Last week, there was bass in the 50-inch range, some of them weighing 42 pounds in southern Maine. Those early season migrants are going to start to hunker down over the next month, but there will still be plenty of fresh bass moving up the coast. And much like New Hampshire and the shores of Massachusetts, herring are still going to be the main source of forage, especially in areas like the Saco and Kennebunk rivers. And with both adult and juvenile herring coming out of there, it pays to have some smaller and larger medals on you, as well as some small and large topwater spooks. The fishing will only improve from here, with more bass on the move up the coast. The full moon on June 4th is bound to push some bigger fish into the southern Maine area, as well as in New Hampshire. And it's safe to say that a lot of the fish that are hunkered down in Cape Cod Bay and Buzzards Bay right now will continue to move north until they reach their summering grounds. Follow those schools of bait this weekend, target areas of heavy structure early in the morning, and fish around the river mouths if you want the best bet at a big striped bass on topwater. Again, Memorial Day weekend tends to be a great time to go fishing, but there's so many extra people on the water. You're going to want to exercise a little bit of extra caution. Keep your head on a swivel out there. Enjoy yourself. Be respectful to other fishermen and boaters around you. And if you haven't done so yet, sign up for Striper Cup. We've got a lot of giveaways and weekly prizes going on just for catching and releasing striped bass. Hope you all enjoy the fishing this weekend. Thanks again for watching another Striper Migration Report from On the Water.